listening to the Metal Command Podcast.
Greetings, everybody. Welcome back to the Metal Command Podcast. Tony here with you. Today, I am here to talk to you about the new Flotsam and Jetsam album. But I am the weapon. But before I get into that, please support the channel, subscribe to the channel, hit that little bell to be notified anytime I do post a video. Leave a comment. Let me know what you think about the Flotsam and Jetsam album and what I say about them in this podcast. Also, by all means, please share the video, like this video, and if you follow me on any other form of social media, like it's Instagram or Facebook, by all means, please give me a follow there. Flotsam and Jetsam, in my opinion, have put out my album of the year. I Am the Weapon. Number one, I haven't heard anything that's going to be coming out or anything that has come out this year that I think is as good as this album. And I don't think Flotsam and Jetsam on these last three albums, I think these last three albums are, it puts anything they've done in the past to shame. It really has. Like, I can't go back to Flotsam and Jetsam's old catalog when you have these three albums, Blood in the Water, The End of Chaos, and of course, I Am the Weapon. It's just really, really hard for me to go back and listen to their back catalog. And I have followed the band, folks, for over 30 years. I own all of their albums. And just to make sure I wasn't crazy, I went back and listened to most of them. And I mean, there's no comparison. These last three records, this band has hit their musical peak, which is crazy to think about. Because the band has been around over 30 years and they are now hitting their musical peak as far as songwriting goes. The consensus among most people is what I'm talking about here. Most people think these last three records are the three best albums Flotsam and Jetsam has basically put out in the past. Now, there are people that might disagree with that, but for the most part, when I look at reviews and I look at social media comments, a lot of people agree with me. So with that said, this is a unique situation. I've never seen this before. Now, we've seen bands come out with, their second or third album and then really hit the ground running with that. And in most cases, that second, third, maybe even fourth record, that's when bands usually hit their stride musically and really just elevate themselves musically. Let me give you an example. Iron Maiden. I know a lot of you like Killers. I like Killers. I like the first two Maiden albums. But most people that like Iron Maiden like the albums Number of the Beast through Seventh Son of a Seventh Son. Number of the Beast is where people think they really elevated themselves musically with Bruce Dickinson. That was album number 3. Metallica, Ride the Lightning, Master of Puppets. The band really hit their stride musically on their second and third album. Right? You get these weird cases where, a band puts out decent material, but then they're gone for a couple decades or a decade or 9 years or whatever, however long they're gone. They go on a long hiatus, then they come back and they put out nothing but great records. Death Angel would be a great example of that. Then you have, of course, a band that might put out a really, really good debut album, but they never quite match that first album. They keep putting records out, but they never quite match the first album. So a band that I would think of would be Sonata Arctica. The debut album is absolutely some of the best power metal I've ever heard, but I don't think they've really ever quite reached that level since. A lot of people say that about Guns N' Roses. People will say like Appetite for Destruction is their best album. It was their debut record. And if you look at the record sales, I believe that's still their highest selling album. And people will say they haven't quite reached the greatness of the debut. You'll get people that'll put out like a band like Saxon who put out really legendary albums like Strong Arm of the Law or Wheels of Steel and say, their new stuff is better than the old and they're really putting it out. But it was a gradual evolution of that, right? And, they might, that really kind of started in the 90s. The band had been around, after their debut, probably almost 20 years. But I have never heard of a band being around over 30 years hitting their peak musically. And this Flotsam and Jetsam thing is a very unique situation. So we have to ask ourselves, how did this come about? What changed? Because obviously something in the band had to have changed for them to for this to happen. Usually it's in the form of people coming into the band or coming back to the band when things like this happen. I mean, that's pretty much what typically happens. So I associate this with two things. And again, I think the strength of these Flotsam and Jetsam albums when it comes to the songwriting is that you have a combination of thrash metal and just a little bit of power metal thrown in there, like US style power metal and melody put in there. And they make more use out of Eric's very melodic voice, which is very unique. Very few thrash bands have a singer like him. I think the only, the most notable thrash band with a melodic singer aside from Flotsam and Jetsam would be Anthrax with Joey Belladonna. But you got to wonder what changed. Two things changed. Michael Gilbert coming back to the band is the first thing that changed. And then Ken Mary coming into the band as well is the other change that happened. And I'm going to elaborate on those in a minute. Now, the unique thing, when I talk about the band's three newest albums being better than anything they've done before, the one thing that they've done is they've beaten nostalgia. What do I mean by that? You ever notice, like, when a band puts out a really good album, people will say it's the best album since this album came out, or it's the best album since that album came out. Like a landmark album those bands have released. Now, for me, Flotsam and Jetsam has never really put out this like landmark, ridiculously awesome album that I reach for almost every time I want to listen to them. And what I mean by that is, like, when I want to listen to Iron Maiden, I'm listening to Number of the Beast, I'm listening to like Power Slave or one of those albums. I'm not really reaching for some of the newer stuff, right? Flotsam never really had an album that I would say, oh my God, I have to listen to that. Or, it was very difficult for me to go and tell people, just start with this album. Because I think their back catalog, even though there are some very good records, I think it's a little hit or miss at times. And that's just my honest opinion. But the new albums, I mean, they're phenomenal. I mean, I think they were like top 3 or 4 every year that they came out with these. This album's number 1. It's the first time Flotsam has ever won my Album of the Year award. But it really coincides with Michael Gilbert rejoining, and then later on, an album later, Ken Mary joining the band. Now, when The End of Chaos came out, and then Blood in the Water came out, one of the things I brought up to Ken Mary when I brought him on the show, I even brought it up to Michael Gilbert, did you feel any pressure on I Am the Weapon to make a phenomenal record, to live up to the hype, the well-deserved hype, might I add, that The End of Chaos and Blood in the Water received? And this is what Ken had to say to me here. Because of all the positive press for the 2 albums before this, did you feel any pressure making this third one? Or was it just such a natural thing for you that you didn't even have to think about that?
Well, we definitely thought about it. I mean, we definitely wanted to make a record at least, equal to Blood in the Water. That was the goal. We're like, hey, let's not go backwards. Let's try to make an album. Let's do everything we can to make a record that's at least that good. And again, I'm going to be 100% honest in this interview. We weren't totally sure we did that. At the end of the process. I mean, we thought we did. We went, wow, I think these songs are going to actually be really cool. But until people hear them and you start getting feedback, you kind of don't know. Like you feel like, yeah, this is working. These are great songs. It's great energy. We love them. But just because we love them doesn't mean that everybody else is going to love them too. So,
yeah.
You just hope for the best. But yes, there was definitely pressure. I mean, we definitely felt the pressure. But I think we kind of ignored the pressure too. We just we just said, well, let's just do what we always do. Let's just make songs that we are really moving to us and we feel excited about. And then hopefully everybody agrees with us.
And that's what he said. And again, there is going to be pressure. You do feel that pressure a little bit. Am I going to make this album really, really good? Is it going to live up to the hype of the last two? Because now people have those high expectations, right? The next thing I brought up, and I'm going to talk about this, overcoming nostalgia, folks. Overcoming nostalgia is what this band has done. You don't really see a lot of reviews saying it's the best album since Doomsday for the Deceiver or No Place for Disgrace. You don't see that. Nobody is saying that. And it's very difficult to overcome nostalgia. A lot of people love Doomsday for the Deceiver. A lot of people love No Place for Disgrace. It's just something you don't see that often. And I asked Michael Gilbert about that. I asked Michael Gilbert, you guys seem to have overcome nostalgia. And this is the interview segment I did with him from the interview that we did, which I'll have that in the show notes. Check it out, what he had to say about that. One of the things that Ken and I discussed on the show was, this is one of the few times, everybody, when you would hear Flotsam and Jetsam over the years, if people really loved the album, you would hear, oh my God, this is the greatest album since No Place for Disgrace or Doomsday for the Deceiver. And a lot of bands run into that, where you run into that like nostalgia thing. And you guys have really overcome that, because when the End of Chaos came out, and I remember vividly when that record came out, a lot of people almost, it's not that they forgot the old stuff, but it wasn't referenced as much as, say, when another band comes out with an album. Oh, it's the best album since, whatever record was really iconic by them. Like someone might, you might have like a Metallica album come out, best album since the Black Album, or, you get an Iron Maiden album comes out. People will say it's the best album since Seventh Son. You don't hear reviews of the Flotsam and Jetsam stuff saying that. I hear reviews of, wow, and this is what I said in my review. I said, wow, this band has really progressed into something, and nobody's really mentioning the old albums, even though they like them. You seem to have overcome that nostalgia. I call it like typecasting, right? That's kind of the best way to put it. And do you see a lot of that with these last, say, 3 records?
Yeah, there's not a comparison. I don't think it's a totally different band in the personnel department, except for me and AK. Mm-hmm. So whenever you change players and you bring these players in as songwriters, you're obviously going to get a little bit of a different sound, and it's along with evolving over the years. This is what we came up with, and I think that the self-titled record, which was just prior to End of Chaos, is when we finally started going, okay, we've got like a really solid foundation for something here, whereas before we toyed around with speed metal, and then we had some rock songs, we had metal songs. I mean, there's been a lot of variations of different types of music that we put on our records. That is good in some ways and bad in other ways. The bad way would be, a lot of metal fans are really true to the craft. They don't want to hear, I'm not saying they're all like this, but a lot of them don't want to hear anything outside that box. And so when you put something out that's not in the thrash genre, they end up just going, it's not thrash, it's more of power metal now, so they don't want to listen to it, But since the self-titled, we've been able to accomplish the power metal genre and all kinds of these other metal genres, or a lot, even death metal. We're playing shows with these bands, and I think it's all attributed to the latest songwriting in the last 4 records, and right. How it's all transpired on vinyl.
Okay, so obviously you heard what Mike had to say about overcoming nostalgia on this album. And one of the things I was thinking about, I never brought this up to Ken Mary, and I really wish I would have brought this up in both of the interviews I've done with him on this show. The one interview we did where we talked more about the last Fifth Angel album, And of course, the recent interview we did for I Am the Weapon. And that is this. Folks, Ken Mary is a producer. I don't know if a lot of you know that. He has worked with and been in some very, very good bands with a lot of talented musicians. Alice Cooper and Pelletary, House of Lords, a lot of these great artists. Fifth Angel, obviously. The guy does produce records. Now, Michael Gilbert, an original member of Flotsam and Jetsam, came back. And when you listen to the self-titled Flotsam and Jetsam album, the album that Michael came back on, you can hear some hints of what was going to come. I didn't think that album was okay. It was a little bit above average for me. That was the album that came out right before End of Chaos. Michael Gilbert came back. It was a welcome addition back to the band because I thought that he brought back that element, an element that they were missing for a little while. But you can kind of hear the direction they probably were going to go on the next record. And so he is, to me, is the catalyst that kicked a lot of this off. He is the change. And then the change that has helped maintain this awesomeness that's in the band between these last three records is Ken Mary. Now, I was asking Michael Gilbert about this. I asked him if Ken Mary was the catalyst behind this, and we talked about this very thing. Check it out. Was Ken the kind of like the guy that when he came in, because he came in 3 albums ago, basically, was like somebody that really was kind of a catalyst for this?
Yes, but I didn't know that at the time.
Okay.
I was terrified when Bittner left, but he called me and said, look, I knew it was just weird. I could tell. And I go, what band? What band is it? And he's like, what, how do you know? How do you know what I'm going to say? And I go, what band? And he's like, Overkill. I'm like, okay, well, congrats, dude. You got to take that gig. You got to take it. So we were in Europe at the time, and Steve had worked a lot with Ken Mary. He goes, I'm going to have a guy send a video, and I want you to check it out. And he sent Ken playing Hammerhead. And I was like, that looks like the guy, But I didn't know that he was going to be such an asset to the band. He's like I said, a world-class producer at the same time. And to have that value in your band is just crazy. But not only that, like, even if I wasn't in a band with him, he's still like one of the coolest dudes I know. I'd still talk to him probably every day. Just, well, right. You know him.
Yeah, exactly. And he's been on the show a couple times, once promoting some of, like the Fifth Angel stuff, and then obviously here. But yeah, it's funny you mentioned that. I thought about that, like what changed, like who was the personnel, what was the personnel change, right? And I almost feel like he was kind of a catalyst for it, because when I go back to albums that the band was doing, you talked about the self-titled album, I talk about the album The Cold, you were kind of going towards what you're doing now, but it felt like, and he came in there, and all of a sudden, I never forget hearing the song "Prisoner of Time" off of End of Chaos. I remember when that song came out. I remember when the album was sent to me, and I'm like, wow. I'm like, this is not the same band that I've been following for 30 years. I'm like, I was blown away by that. And, again, it's not easy to release a streak of 3 great records. And I just think that he was the catalyst for that. I think you had kind of a nucleus there, but he comes in and kind of brings that. It felt like he brought that out of everybody. Yeah.
More so in this record than any of them. When he first got in the band, he felt like he had to tiptoe a little bit, I've never been came into a band that's been around for 30 years. So I don't really know how he felt, but I can only guess that, coming in, you can't just come in and start like making changes and stuff like right away. You have to gain the trust of the guys. You got to play with them. You got to get to know them over the years. And I think now he's reached his full potential with this band, and it's the pedal to the metal, and it's still there. Like this band isn't losing any. There's still tons of gas in the tank with this band. I still feel like I'm 25 years old. I know the rest of the guys do too.
Yeah.
So we might have released 3 good ones in a row, but I think there's going to be more after this. I'm sure of it. As a matter of fact, we're writing again. So
Yeah, he mentioned some songs that were written. They just didn't fit the album. So I'm interested to hear what those might sound like down the road when you guys do start doing another record.
well, one of them did make it on the record, which is it's called Beneath the Shadows, and that one there's a couple guys in the band that are still like, what the hell with this thing? But I kind of went back to my experimental stuff. Ken called me up and said we need something a little slower, maybe that is driving. I go, okay. So I wrote that, and I think I was listening to a lot of Pantera at the time because it was inspired by Walk, and but when I finished doing my recording on it and demoed it out for those guys and sent it over to Ken, Steve calls me up. He's like, "What are you doing writing a ZZ Top song?" Because it does kind of have that vibe to it, but a little heavier than LaGrange, I think.
So, what's the reception been like for you guys? You're playing shows in Europe. You're playing all these shows everywhere. You've been around this band for the better part of 35, 40 years. I mean, it's pretty close, right? What's the reception been like for you guys, say over these last 3 records? And has this been like the best response you've ever seen to where this band, as at compared to where you've been before?
Other than the first 2 records, absolutely. If those are the comparisons right there. We've had nothing but killer reviews about the last 3 records.
Yeah.
Of course there's going to be some haters that are going to talk a little bit of crap, but whatever, I bring it, because all that does is make people want to listen to it more, and why, they wonder why they're hating it. So, I have never listened to any of our old records like in their entirety. And the last 3 records I listened to quite a bit, actually. And one of the reasons I kind of feel like a proud father, like I'm just proud of my guys, proud of the band, we accomplished something. We put a mark in the business, and to release something like that, it's out in the world, it's something to be proud of. So.
Yeah. And that's Michael Gilbert talking about what changed in the band, talking about Ken Mary. I mean, honestly, those are the 2 personnel changes, in my opinion, that really have led to this band putting out what I would call 3 landmark releases. I'm going to sound like a broken record, but again, these 3 records they've put out make the rest of the back catalog hard for me to go back and listen to. No disrespect to the effort and hard work that went into those albums, but the band was kind of like going steady here, and then it just went up here. First of all, when End of Chaos came out, I was blown away. I couldn't even believe this was the same band. But the formula that made these albums great, Michael Gilbert and Ken Mary coming in, obviously sort of facilitated this whole thing, in my opinion. But the other thing is the formula of really heavy thrash metal, a little bit of variety in the speed of the songs, and having that little bit of melody that you would hear in power metal. Not a lot, but just enough to make these songs catchy and to make use of Eric's really awesome melodic voice. That's the formula they've had, man. And the songwriting, you can't argue with it. I mean, music is always a subjective thing, folks. But when you have this many people saying almost the exact same thing, you've done something right. You've done a really good job. Just a weird situation, man. Peaking after 30 years of existence. And Flotsam has displayed some greatness on certain albums. The first 2 albums I do like. I like them a lot, actually. I like the first one a lot. I like the album Quattro. I like the album Drift. I think those are 2 great albums. I liked High. And then you kind of got really hit or miss with like Unnatural Selection and some of these other records. The Cold wasn't a bad record. But again, they really weren't putting out like anything that I would say, man, that's a landmark album. Man, that's album of the year. Man, that is like, I have to listen to this album nonstop. They've never done that. They were always known as the band that Jason Newsted used to be in before he went to Metallica. You know, you don't hear that anymore. You don't hear people talking about that as much. I brought it up in the interview because Michael Gilbert's an original member, and I did want to ask him about it. But generally speaking, you don't really hear that. So you've overcome nostalgia. You've peaked musically 30 plus years in. It's just a crazy story. But anyhow, I don't want to get too much further into this or keep talking about the same thing over and over again. So I'm just going to end it off here. Album of the year for me, I Am the Weapon, Flotsam and Jetsam. Absolutely phenomenal record. Michael Gilbert, really nice guy to have on my show. Ken Mary is a great guy. And I'm really glad to see this band doing as well as they are. It's really cool to see a band just kind of late in their career peak like this. It's one of the coolest things I've ever seen. It's a very unprecedented thing that has happened. You don't see this happen too often. I don't think I've ever seen it happen where a band's been around this long putting albums out and just suddenly just puts out 3 ridiculously awesome albums. But if you're going to peak, hey, better late than never. So with that said, thanks for watching. Stay metal.